Pleased to welcome everybody to the first fall lecture of the Judeo-Christian Studies Chair. I'm Ronna Berger. I'm a professor in the philosophy department, and I'm the Catherine and Henry J. Geisman Chair in charge of this lecture series. So tonight we're here for the Martin M. Kelly Memorial Lecture, and we're very pleased to welcome Bill McClay as our guest speaker. Now, some of us first knew Professor McClay as Bill when he was in the Tulane History Department from 1987 to 1999. And I'm afraid I have to confess what is seeming to be a general principle to me. We don't really realize our colleagues' prestigious standing and all their professional recognition when they're just a part of our own little world. They have to come back as guest speakers. So I can only give you a glimpse now into Professor McClay's accomplishments. His undergraduate education was in the Great Books program of St. John's College. I mention that because so many of our graduate students here are also fellow alumni. And he received his PhD in history from Johns Hopkins in 1987, at which point he joined our faculty. Professor McClay currently holds the G.T. and Libby Blankenship Chair, did I get it right? In the history of liberty at the University of Oklahoma. He also holds and has held many important public positions. Just to mention a couple now, he was appointed in 2002 to the Advisory Board for the National Endowment for the Humanities, and he's currently a senior scholar at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington. Among his numerous books, one, The Masterless, Self and Society in Modern America, won the Merle Curti Award of the Organization of American Historians. And we're now awaiting the appearance, I think in just a few months, of a new book, Why Place Matters, Geography, Identity, and Civic Life in Modern America. It's about to come out, huh? Now, when I first thought of Bill for tonight's lecture, I wasn't really aware of how absolutely perfectly fitting his work is for this series. Then I came upon an article he published just a week ago. I found it in Mosaic, concerning evangelical Christian and Jewish relations. That alliance, he explained, will always be at least partially a matter of strange bedfellows. That can't be helped. It shouldn't be denied. The differences are profound. But at the same time, he went on, there is a deep community, a commonality, going to the heart of both faiths, revealed by and through the course of 2 millennia of human history. It is, I think, I'm still quoting McClay's statement here, it is, I think, most succinctly expressed in the idea that both traditions worship the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That phrase carries the weight of a distinct cosmology, anthropology, and moral universe. I hope we'll get a taste of that tonight. We have the privilege of hearing a talk on the strange persistence of guilt in a post-religious age. Please join me in welcoming Bill McClay.
Thank you so much, Ronna. Did everybody hear me okay? It's so great to be back here. I really always love to come to New Orleans and see my friends, see you, Sam, Raymer. It's so good to see you. I'll just put this down here. I also was reminded of of the things I love about New Orleans when I stepped off the plane and walked out onto the concourse, and the first thing that greeted me was a banner at the airport that proclaims that Ochsner Hospital is #1 in the nation for liver transplants. Only New Orleans would brag about such a thing. It didn't specify whether this refers to supply or demand, but it seemed like a characteristic New Orleans blend of pride and insouciance, but refreshing. And so I thought I'd begin with that story because the rest of my talk is not going to be nearly as refreshing as that story. This is part of an ongoing project, and if I could summarize the orientation of the project in a single sentence, it would be to say that I believe guilt is becoming an ever more powerful and pervasive presence in contemporary life, even as we lack increasingly the formal means of recognizing it, let alone obtaining absolution for it. I'll be making some rather large claims for guilt as an extremely potent and increasingly potent force in historical change. These are claims that admittedly will have to be supported largely by inference, since guilt is not a phenomenon that lends itself to being easily or precisely measured. And if it is hard to measure in individuals, it's even harder to assess in nations and peoples and other collectivities. But such is the nature of the beast. We should count and measure wherever we can and whenever we can with meaning and accuracy. But if we restricted historical explanations to only those factors that can be seen and touched, quantified, and compared, we run the risk of embracing a sterile sort of precision which keeps the record clean by refusing to ask the most interesting questions. I can identify the precise moment when I began to think about this book. It was when I became aware of something called the Atheist Bus Campaign in the United Kingdom. Any of you aware of this? This was something that Richard Dawkins and some others started up because they were upset by the ubiquity of buses, transit buses that had billboards on the sides promoting Christianity, particularly evangelical Christianity, Jesus. And really annoyed by this and thought a counter-campaign would be just the trick. So what they did, he got together this group of people and they came up with a slogan and installed it on a number of buses. The slogan was this. This is the core of the Atheist Bus Campaign. There's probably no God. Now stop worrying and enjoy your life. This struck me for several reasons. One, I was amazed that Richard Dawkins, who I do think of as a clever man and a good writer, would come up with something so lame and so tentative sounding. There's probably no God. What? Probably no God? Come on, man. That's not enough to get me to stop worrying. Probably no God. And secondly, and more seriously, what is the connection between belief in God and worrying or the enjoyment of life? Is there a necessary connection between the belief in God and the presence of worrying and non-enjoyment? This seemed to me a non sequitur. Leaving aside questions of am I destroying everything here? Leaving aside questions of truth, just on a psychological level. Is that going to work all right? Okay. But of course, there's a lineage to this idea. Friedrich Nietzsche, on the genealogy of morality, argued that the very idea of God or of the gods originated hand in hand with the feeling of indebtedness towards forebears and ancestors, which eventually would become seen as gods. Nietzsche notes that the German word Schuld, guilt, is the same as the word for debt, the plural Schulden. And I should pause here to note that all through this talk, and in Nietzsche as well, there's a problem with the conflation of guilt as a forensic term, referring to culpability, guilt as in being guilty of an offense before the law, and guilt as a subjective or emotional term, that is being guilty versus feeling guilty. They're analytically separable, but it's difficult to separate them in discourse. Anyway, let me read you brief passages from Nietzsche in which he talks about the way in which the feeling of indebtedness to ancestors coalesces over time into seeing the ancestors as larger and larger and larger until they take on the characteristics of a deity. And then, and here Nietzsche, I'll break in with Nietzsche, the feeling of indebtedness toward a deity continued to grow for several millennia, and indeed always in the same proportion as the concept of and feeling for God grew in the world and was carried aloft. The advent of the Christian God as the maximal God yet achieved thus also brought about the appearance of the greatest feeling of indebtedness on earth. Now, Nietzsche continues, assuming we have now started in the reverse direction, we should be justified in deducing with no little probability that the unstoppable decline in faith in the Christian God means there is decline in the consciousness of human debt. Indeed, the possibility that the complete victory of atheism might release humanity from this whole feeling of being indebted towards its beginnings, its causa prima. Atheism and a sort of second innocence belong together. So atheism is a second innocence, a new and unencumbered spring for the human race. Stop worrying and enjoy your life. Somehow it doesn't seem to have happened that way, despite Nietzsche's predictions. And that's part of what I want to get into tonight. A better prophet, I think, was Freud. Freud, of course, no friend of religion, but willing grudgingly to give it some due. In his grand and gloomy book, Civilization and Its Discontents, Freud declared the tenacious sense of guilt is the most important problem in the development of civilization. In fact, he continued, it seems that the price we pay for our advance in civilization is a loss of happiness through the heightening of the sense of guilt. Such guilt made for an elusive quarry. It was hard to identify, hard to understand, frequently dwelling on an unconscious level, easily mistaken for something else. It often appears to us, Freud said, as a sort of malaise, Unbehagen, the same word that is discontents in the title of the book, dissatisfaction, for which people seek other explanations. Guilt turns out to be crafty, something of a trickster, a chameleon, capable of disguising itself, hiding out, changing its size and appearance, even its location. And yet, it manages to persist and deepen, even despite all its protean transformations. I think that Freud, while mistaken in many other things, that's another lecture for another occasion, showed prophetic insight in formulating this seeming paradox. By connecting the phenomenon of rising guilt to the phenomenon of civilizational advance, he was pointing out an unsuspected byproduct of progress itself. He was also posing a problem that will only become more pronounced in the generations to come, one for which his own invention of psychoanalysis was no solution, but that remains an issue of unrelenting importance. Thanks in part to Freud, we live in a therapeutic age, and nothing illustrates that fact more clearly than striking ways in which the sources of guilt's power and the nature of its would-be antidotes have changed for us. Freud sought to relieve in his patients the worst mental burdens and pathologies imposed by their oppressive and hyperactive consciences, while deliberately refraining from rendering judgment about whether the guilty feelings emanating from those consciences had any moral justification. In other words, more simply, he sought to release his patients from guilt's moral weight by removing guilt's moral significance and redesignating it as just another psychological phenomenon. He sought to demoralize guilt, to treat guilt as a strictly subjective and emotional matter. Health was to be the only remaining criterion for success and failure, and health was a matter of managing an equilibrium among the competing elements in the psyche. And the non-judgmental therapeutic worldview, whose seeds he planted, has come to full flower in modern America, which in turn has profoundly affected the standing and meaning of the most venerable moral transactions. Take, for example, the various ways in which forgiveness, a related concept, is now understood. Forgiveness has long been one of the golden words of our language. It glistens with 100 admirable qualities, and its purity and moral prestige seem beyond challenge. To forgive others is taken to be a sign of a full and munificent heart, a sacrificial heart, and moreover, a heart that wisely recognizes the fleeting nature of life and the universal weakness of all human beings, very much including oneself. Yet forgiveness, rightly understood, does not deny the reality of justice. For to forgive, whether one is forgiving trespasses or debts, precisely means suspending all such just and legitimate claims in the name of the higher ground of love and human solidarity. That is why forgiveness, rightly understood, is both costly and rare. But go to the self-help shelves of American bookstores today, and you'll find something very different. You'll see books bearing such titles as Total Forgiveness, and Forgiveness, How to Make Peace with Your Past and Get On with Your Life, and Choosing Forgiveness, Your Journey to Freedom, and Forgiveness, the Greatest Healer of All. Dozens of websites devote themselves to the subject, including a website called Forgive for Good. Say that 5 times. By one Frederick Luskin, PhD. That always goes with his name, PhD. Frederick Luskin, PhD. Director and co-founder of the Stanford Forgiveness Project and author of Forgive for Good, a proven prescription for health and happiness. He liked alliteration and internal rhymes. Luskin declares, forgiveness is for you and not for anyone else. Even the respected journalist Greg Easterbrook posted an article on the BeliefNet website entitled, Forgiveness is Good for Your Health. Now, I don't mean to disparage these writings in a blanket way or call them utterly wrong. There's a great deal to be said for any act that can release the soul from captivity to hateful, poisonous emotions. But the shift in emphasis is notable, no? In this new acceptation, forgiveness is all about the forgiver and his or her well-being. And the motivation sometimes borders on the suspect. As Dr. Luskin puts it, in arguing for the health-giving benefits of forgiving, I'm not making this up. Remember that a life well lived is your best revenge. Forgiveness is about personal power. This puts a rather different cast on the idea that the forgiving heart rises above the one that wounded it. In seeing forgiveness as a form of revenge and a locus of power, we are a long way from Shakespeare's Portia in The Merchant of Venice, who spoke about what was called the quality of mercy, which droppeth as a gentle rain from heaven, and blesses both him that gives and him that takes. It's an even longer way from Christ's anguished cry from the cross, forgive them for they know not what they do. And perhaps even further from the most basic sense of forgiveness, the canceling of a monetary debt or the pardoning of a criminal offense, in either case constituting a very conscious suspension of the rightful demands of justice. So we value forgiveness, we venerate forgiveness, but we're very confused about it. And in our confusion, we may have produced a situation in which forgiveness has in fact very nearly lost its weight as well as its meaning. Like the similar acts of confession or apology or other transactions in the moral economy of sin and guilt, forgiveness is in danger of being debased into a kind of cheap grace, a waiving of standards entirely, standards without which such transactions have no meaning. Forgiveness only makes sense, to repeat, in the presence of a robust sense of justice. Without it, it becomes a sanctimonious way of simply moving on. So there's a problem with the understanding of guilt and forgiveness in our day, a transformation of them into floating signifiers without any clear connection to the antecedents to which they once corresponded. As I've tried to argue, this arises out of the influential therapeutic view that the experience of guilt doesn't involve genuine moral issues, but rather the interplay of psychic forces that don't relate to anything morally consequential. One might call this position, just for purposes of applying a label, an assertion of the fundamental unreality of guilt. The unreality of guilt. But that's not the only thing that confuses us. There's another factor at work, one that might be called the infinite extensibility of guilt. This proceeds from a very different set of assumptions and is a surprising byproduct of modernity's proudest product, its ever-growing capacity to comprehend and control the physical world. In a world in which the web of relationships between causes and effects becomes ever better understood, in which means of communication and transportation become ever more efficient and effective, individuals become more powerful and effective agents. The range of our potential moral responsibility, and therefore of our potential guilt, expands to literally infinite proportions. In an ever-shrinking, ever more interconnected world, it's theoretically possible for every living person to go anywhere that he or she wants to go, and to be made literally or at least virtually present to any other person in ways that promise to become ever more vivid and high definition in the future. In such a world where there are few intrinsic limits to what I can do, there's almost nothing for which I cannot be in some way held accountable. I can see pictures of a starving child in a remote corner of the world on my television and know for a fact that I could travel to that remote place and relieve that child's immediate suffering if I cared to. This would not have been possible in the 17th century. It's possible now. Whatever donation I make to a charitable organization, it is never as much as I could have given. I can never diminish my carbon footprint enough, or give to the poor enough, or support medical research enough, or otherwise do the things that would render me morally blameless. Colonialism, slavery, structural poverty, environmental degradation, deforestation, the demands on an active conscience are literally as endless as an active imagination's ability to conjure them. So these two factors, the therapeutic unreality of guilt paired with the crushing hyperabundance of it, would seem to be diametrically opposed. How can something illusory also be something omnipresent? Are we guilty of nothing or everything? But in practice, the two tend to reinforce one another. The disproportionality of the latter leads to its being managed by means of the former. Not knowing how to cope with the monumental scale of our infinitely extensible guilt, we dissolve it into a Woody Allen joke. But what cannot be laughed out of existence is a tenacious sense of moral incompleteness and a weighty sense of moral burden. A burden that all of us, except perhaps sociopaths, share to a greater or lesser extent. And as Freud knew, this sense can hide for a very long time in the dark, moving the chess pieces with its invisible hand. So excessive is our propensity for guilt, particularly in the developed nations of the West, that the French writer Pascal Bruckner, in a recent study called The Tyranny of Guilt, has identified the problem as Western masochism. He says, the lingering presence of the old notion of original sin, the ancient poison of damnation, holds even secular philosophers and sociologists captive to its logic. So that, and I quote, the more they proclaim themselves to be agnostic, atheists, and freethinkers, the more they take us back to the religious beliefs they are challenging. As a consequence, he continued, most of Western thought is little more than a mechanical denunciation of the West in which remorse has ceased to be connected with precise historical circumstances and has instead become a dogma, a spiritual commodity, a form of currency manifested in the non-stop duty of repentance. Well, as much as I admire Bruckner's bold analysis, and the book is in a peculiar way very entertaining, I think it's a defective analysis because the problem goes deeper than a mere question of cultural masochism arising out of vestigial religious reflexes. It is, after all, not merely our pathologies that dispose us in this direction. The pathologies themselves have an anterior source, if I'm right, in the very things of which we are most rightly proud, our knowledge of the world, of its causes and effects, and our power to shape and alter those causes and effects. Unless one takes the position that guilt is to be banished in toto from the human condition, a position that would be both foolish and horrible, one has to face the fact that in a world of ever-growing knowledge, there's no easy way of deciding how much guilt is enough and how much is too much. Hence, the paradox that Freud identified, that modernity gives rise to ever-growing guilt. And so with this paradox, we come to the heart of my argument, which is that notwithstanding all claims about our living in a post-religious, post-Christian world devoid of censorious public morality, I argue that in fact we live in a world that carries around an enormous and growing burden of guilt and yearns to be free of it. This condition cannot be explained away as nothing more than a psychological aberration. It is, and I repeat, a direct product of the very things of which we in the modern West have been most understandably proud. Our heightening of moral awareness reflected in the adoption of universal standards for the rights of man, of international law, and our achievements in the realm of science and technology, which have enabled us to exert greater and greater mastery over the terms of our human existence, our physical existence. These achievements have created psychological burdens that are too little acknowledged and forever looking for an opportunity to discharge themselves. Indeed, it is impossible to exaggerate how many of the deeds of individual men and women, even outwardly vicious or violent or dehumanizing deeds, can be traced to the powerful and inextinguishable need of human beings to feel morally justified, to be found innocent, to feel themselves right with the world. One would be correct to expect that such a powerful need, as powerful as the physical needs, would continue to find ways to manifest itself, even if it does so in odd and perverse ways. For example, and I'll come to this more later, in the rise of the extraordinary prestige accorded to victims as a category in the contemporary world. This brings me to a very interesting and curious story full of significance in these matters. It comes from a New York Times op-ed column by Daniel Mendelsohn called Stolen Suffering. Mendelsohn, a professor at Bard College, a classical scholar, has written a book about his family's experience of the Holocaust. He tells in the column of hearing the story of an orphan Jewish girl who trekked 2,000 miles from Belgium to Ukraine, surviving the Warsaw Ghetto, murdering a German officer, and taking refuge in forests where she was protected by kindly wolves. This story was given wide circulation in a 1997 book, and it was generally accepted as true. But it was recently discovered at the time of this column to have been a complete fabrication created by a Belgian Roman Catholic woman named Monique de Veil. Such a deception, Mendelsohn argued, is not an isolated event. It needs to be understood in the context of a growing number of phony memoirs, as he calls them, such as the notorious child survivor Holocaust memoir Fragments, or Love and Consequences, the putative autobiography of a young mixed-race woman raised by a black foster mother in gang-infested Los Angeles. These books were, according to Mendelsohn, a plagiarism of other people's trauma. It's a beautiful phrase, a plagiarism of other people's trauma. Written not as they claim to be by members of oppressed classes, the Jews during World War II, the impoverished African Americans of South Central Los Angeles, but by members of relatively safe or privileged classes. Interestingly, too, he notes the authors seem to have an unusual degree of identification with their subjects. In fact, a degree of identification approaching the pathological. Ms. de Veil, for example, declared rather astonishingly after being found out that, quote, "The story is mine, not actually reality, but my reality, my way of surviving." Mendelsohn goes on to draw very pertinent conclusions from these stories about how we've lost a sense of reality we're too taken in by the demands of empathy in our culture, and so on. And that's all, I think, valid. But I think there's an even profounder inference to be drawn from this strange phenomenon. We've all heard about stolen valor, those who inflate their wartime exploits, real or imaginary, to impress others. It's not hard to imagine the motive behind such fraudulence, the desire to be thought a hero, identified with heroic virtues. But this is different. This is stolen suffering. And the identification being pursued is an identification not with heroism, but with certifiable victims. It is a peculiar kind of identity theft. How to account for it? What is motivating it? Why would comfortable and privileged people want to identify with victims? And why would their efforts appeal to such a substantial reading public? Or to pose the question more generally in a way that I think goes to the heart of our dilemma, how can one account for the rise of the extraordinary prestige of victims as a category in the contemporary world? I believe the explanation is traceable back to the extraordinary weight of guilt in our time, the pervasive need to find innocence through moral absolution and to discharge one's moral burden somehow, and the fact that the conventional means of finding that absolution are no longer generally available. Making a claim to the status of certified victim or identification with victims, however, offers a substitute means by which the moral burden of sin can be shifted and one's innocence affirmed. Recognition of this substitution may operate with particular strength in certain individuals, such as these authors. But the strangeness of the phenomenon suggests there may be a larger shift of sensibility, which represents a change in the moral economy of sin in modern America, and almost none of it has occurred consciously. In the modern West, that moral economy of sin, of guilt and sin, remains deeply tied to the Judeo-Christian tradition. And the fundamental truth about sin in the Judeo-Christian tradition is that sin must be paid or otherwise discharged. It cannot be dissolved by divine fiat, nor repressed, nor borne forever. In the Jewish moral world in which Christianity originated, and without which it would have been unthinkable, sin had always to be paid for, often by the sacrificial shedding of blood. Its effects could never be ignored or willed away, which is precisely why in the Christian context, forgiveness of sin was specifically related to Jesus Christ's atoning sacrifice, his vicarious payment for all human sins procured by his death on the cross and made available to those who embraced him in faith. Forgiveness has an enormously high standing in the Christian faith, but it's grounded in fundamental theological and metaphysical beliefs about the person and work of Christ, which are in turn traceable back to Jewish notions of sin and how one pays for it. It makes little sense without them, without those beliefs, without those assumptions. Forgiveness or expiation or atonement, all these concepts promising freedom from the weight of guilt, are grounded in a moral transaction enacted within the universe of a moral economy of sin. But how in a society such as ours that retains its Judeo-Christian moral reflexes but has abandoned the corresponding metaphysics, how can a credible substitute means of discharging the weight of sin be found? One workable way to be at peace with oneself and feel innocent and right with the world is to identify oneself as a certifiable victim or identify with victims. That's why the Mendelssohn story is so important and so profoundly indicative, even if it deals with a rather extreme case. It points toward the way in which identification with victims and the appropriation of victim status has become an irresistible moral attraction for so many. It suggests the real possibility that claiming victim status is the sole sure means left of absolving oneself and securing a sense of innocence. It explains the extraordinary prestige of victimhood in modern American and Western societies. Why? Why should that be so? Because with ever more expanding moral responsibility comes inevitable moral guilt, for reasons already explained. So if one wishes to be innocent, one must find a way to make the claim that one cannot be held morally responsible. And that's precisely what the status of victimhood accomplishes. But victimhood at its most potent not only promises release from responsibility, but an ability to displace that responsibility onto others. As a victim, one can project onto another person, the victimizer or oppressor, any feelings of guilt he might harbor, and in projecting that guilt, lift it off his own shoulders. The result is an astonishing reversal in which the designated victimizer plays the role of the scapegoat, upon whose head the sin comes to rest and who pays the price for it. By contrast, in appropriating the status of victim or identifying oneself with victims, the victimized can experience a profound sense of moral release or recovered innocence. It's no wonder this should have become so common an outlook in our time. So effectively does it deal with the burden of guilt. Though in the long run, the social pathologies in the larger society that this will give rise to will surely be unsustainable. All of this creates enormous problems, especially in our public life, precisely because it doesn't deal honestly with the problem of sin, but merely plays a game of projection and displacement, of offloading our toxic waste onto one another, a game in which everyone is pinning his own guilty tail on somebody else's vulnerable donkey. One sees some of these problems in, for example, the public apologies for various malfeasances of the past, such as the fairly recent apology for slavery put forth by the United States Senate. Not that such an apology is in any way a bad thing. It is important and in the national interest to find ways to achieve reconciliation on matters of such long-standing pain and woundedness. But consider how completely such actions serve to support the infinite extensibility of guilt, an empire without boundaries, in which no feature of American life is so remote or intimate as to be immune from the charge of complicity. In that realm, nothing can ever be forgiven because moral responsibility is everywhere and nowhere, too pervasive and diffuse ever to be located, let alone answered. This example leads towards, and I want to talk a little bit about group guilt, and particularly about post-war settlements in the aftermath of war, in which a lot of these same factors operate at a collective level. The assignment of responsibility for causing a war, the designation of war guilt, the assessment of punishments and reparations, the identification of war crimes, the compensation of war victims, and so on. All of these are thought to be part of settling a war's effects justly, are part and parcel of the moral economy of guilt operating on the national and international level. But the standards have been steadily raised, and the demands of justice are one and the same time very demanding and ever more difficult to satisfy. As political scientist Thomas Berger declares at the beginning of an excellent book on war and guilt in post-World War II Europe, we live in an age of apology and recrimination. Guilt is everywhere around us. Its potential sources have only begun to be plumbed as our understanding of the buried past widens and deepens. Sooner or later, says Berger, who has a kind of gallows humor, we are all going to be sorry. Much of this heightened moral awareness is something new in human history, stemming from the growing social and political pluralism of Western democracies and the unprecedented influence of universalized norms of human rights and justice, supported by an array of international institutions and non-governmental organizations ranging from the International Criminal Courts to Amnesty International. In addition, the larger narratives through which nations organize their history, through which they constitute their collective memory, are increasingly subject to monitoring and careful scrutiny by constituent ethnic, linguistic, cultural, and other subgroups, and are responsive to demands that those larger histories reflect the nation's past misdeeds and express correction and contrition for them. Never has there been a keener and more widespread sense of particularized grievances at work throughout the world. and never have such grievances been able to count on receiving such a thorough and generally sympathetic public hearing. At times, the moral status of victims seems virtually unassailable, while that of the nation-state seems irredeemable. One of my teachers, John Hyam, who was at Johns Hopkins, who was a leading historian of immigration at the beginning of his career, by the end wrote this: "The nation-state is nothing more than the villain in other people's stories." This may be an overstatement, but there's no disputing the fact that history itself, particularly in terms of coming to terms with the wrongs of the past and the search for historical justice, is a ever more salient element in not only the writing of history, but in national and international politics. We see it in the concern for past abuses of indigenous peoples, colonized peoples, subordinated races and classes, and the like. And we see it related in ways that nations relate their own stories of war. Far from being buried, the past is alive with moral contestation and guilt. All this might seem to represent a form of moral progress, just as surely as the scientific and technological progress of modernity does. Perhaps the most impressive example of sustained collective penitence in human history has come from the government and people of Germany, who've done so much to atone for the sins of Nazism. But the trouble is, how much penitence is enough? How long? When can we say that the German people, who are, after all, an entirely different cast of characters from those who lived under the Nazis, when can we say that they're free and clear and have paid their debt to the world and to the past? Who could possibly make that judgment? And will there come a day, has it already arrived, when the Germans will have had enough of this and begin to seek their redemption by other means? This points to another problem with post-war settlements, and that problem is that our age's heightened universal moral standards apply universally, which is to say they are weapons on a pivot which can whirl around and be trained to devastating effect on the very ones who are promoting them. Those who stand in judgment can and should be held to the same standards they impose. The mirror of guilt points back at them, too. Who, after all, is pure and wise enough to administer such post-war justice with impartiality and detachment and impeccable moral credibility? What nation or entity is sufficiently without sin to cast the decisive stone? The Nuremberg and Tokyo war crimes trials were landmarks in establishing institutional entities administering and enforcing international law. But they were also of questionable legality, reflecting the imposition of ad hoc ex post facto laws administered by victors whose own hands were far from being entirely clean. Consider the irony of Soviet judges sitting in judgment of crimes their own regime committed with impunity. Indeed, victors who might well have been made to stand trial themselves had the tables been turned for the firebombing of Dresden or the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki or dozens of other acts. The algebra of sin demands some kind of atonement, but for some aspects of the past, there is no imaginable way of making that transaction without creating sins of equivalent dimension. What possible atonement can there be for, say, the institution of slavery? It is no wonder that the issue of reparations for slavery surfaces periodically, and understandably. And yet, it is simply beyond the power of the present or the future to atone for the enormities of the past in any effective way. The takeaway, however, for those of us who teach history, is that a proper moral education needs to involve a knowledge of our individual and collective guilt, a guilt for which there is no imaginable atonement or easily defined limit. That is not a satisfactory state of affairs, but what to do about it is another matter. As this account suggests, there may be, therefore, an intrinsic conflict in post-war settlements between the quest for justice and the path to reconciliation and healing. Sometimes the latter, reconciliation and healing, may result in opportunistic decisions that come to seem genuinely shameful in retrospect. David Blight's magisterial book, Race and Reunion, dealt with just such a conflict in the wake of the American Civil War. He argued that the sectional reconciliation of the North and South, which was miraculous after such a bloody war, was achieved at the expense of the freed slaves, whose rightful demands for simple justice and dignity would have to wait a century before being fulfilled. This is an example of what Thomas Berger calls the tragedy of transitional justice, a pattern of accommodation and half measures that he finds to have been acted out to a greater or lesser extent in the Austrian, German, and Japanese responses to their post-war rehabilitations. In all such instances, the requirements of large-scale social change proved too daunting. The purging of power of old elites, for example, proved impractical in situations where their expertise and experience was invaluable for the rebuilding of shattered economies. And see the devathification of Iraq as an example of the perils of such a purge. National narratives might be allowed to fudge the truth for the sake of national respect, as was done in the case of post-war Austria, which long described itself as Hitler's first victim, a half-truth at best, rather than his ardent accomplice, closer to the truth of the matter. This changed with the revelations about the Austrian president and former UN Secretary General Kurt Waldheim's possible involvement in war crimes. It seems that the sheer passage of time is required for societies to have the ability to engage fully with the moral implications of their own past, with guilt and innocence. In the meantime, transitional justice, to use Berger's term, is the best that can be reasonably expected, however morally unsatisfactory that may seem by universalistic standards of justice. So prudence and moral purity are incompatible, and guilt remains. So where does this leave us? Back to Freud, Freud's gloomy argument that guilt is a concomitant of modernity, that it will grow and ramify with the development of all the things we call progress. And Pache, Richard Dawkins, the expunging of religion is unlikely to produce worry-free people. On the contrary, religion was and still is for a great many people at least one way that the moral economy of guilt could be managed. Its elimination would leave nothing in its place. So it appears that the atheist bus campaign notwithstanding, there is no simple way to stop worrying and enjoy your life. That this subtractive, Rousseauistic idea of human innocence, man is born free but is everywhere in moral chains, that this is a mirage. This makes me recall an experience I had when I was a college student at St. John's, when we were visited, our class was visited by Gregory Bateson, the famous anthropologist, and who was the stepfather of one of my classmates. And in a class that was discussing the sort of importance of memory and the demands of memory, Bateson at one point stood up, walked to the blackboard, picked up an eraser. You remember what erasers are, right? Picked up an eraser and erased part of the board, set the eraser down, and went back to his seat, and then said that human life needs this. And he later, in his publications, picked up on this image. Human life needs an eraser. It needs forgetfulness, Nietzsche himself often said. And indeed, this had a powerful effect on me at the time. But in retrospect, I realized that Bateson was naive. Guilt is a relentless hunter, and it knows generally what it is that it's seeking. It finds its relief not in forgetting, but in absolution or atonement, just the kind of release that a post-religious age no longer offers. And that, as I see it, is our dilemma, the dilemma of guilt's persistence in an age that no longer has a good way of understanding it and very few ways of mitigating its power. Recognition, however, is a beginning, and I hope I've begun that process tonight. Thank you. possible for us to live in ways that fail to take seriously, whether notionally or operationally, the idea that we live lives that have a moral significance, that our actions have moral significance, that some things are better than others, some things are more desirable than others. I think it's a problem for the reductionist view that it can't account for this strange persistence. And so that's. But you mentioned those 3 books, and I wanted to comment. The Menninger, I actually haven't read that book, but I just recently reread his book, Whatever Became of Sin, which was published in 1973. I don't know when the other one, whether it was an earlier book. It sounds like it might have been earlier. It is. Because, with Carl Menninger, his family started the eponymous Menninger Clinic in Topeka, Kansas, and he was very. If you read the Whatever Became of Sin, the first half of the book is devoted to this notion that we are much too punitive, particularly about things like masturbation. There's a lot about that. He's really. I'm trying to think of the right verb, but I mean, he's very concerned about that issue. And then, about midway through the book, he does this pivot and suddenly says, well, we can't do without the idea of sin because then our lives have no moral significance, and there are things that only priests and ministers can do, and we can't think of psychology or psychotherapy as a sort of triumphalist discipline. And it's an impressive example of what you're talking about, of a kind of dualism, a kind of incoherence in his approach. It was a very influential book, and a lot of ministers liked it. It's 40 years old now. A lot of ministers like it, and you still see it cited now and then. But it reflects just the kind of incoherence you're talking about. I mean, Reef, we could be here all night talking about Reef and the triumph of the therapeutic. But I think one of the things I'm suggesting is the therapeutic has not been entirely triumphant. And I don't think Reef would have been able to write the book and have the kind of following that he's had if it were. If there weren't a sense that in some way some moral deficit is left behind by the triumph of the therapeutic. And, Reef can barely contain himself in times in his contempt for the kind of person that the therapeutic man becomes, even though technically he's being very neutral, just describing a historical change. No, not really. He's delivering himself of a thundering Jeremiad against the very therapeutic culture that he proclaimed, whose triumph he's proclaiming. I don't know there's much to say about Skinner. It's the operant conditioning. But reductive in its own way. Well, that is above my pay grade, as a famous man once said. I left my robes back at the apartment, but my prophetic robes. But no, certainly, I think it's possible. It's strange. History is full of things that nobody could have imagined or imagined happening in the way they did, as quickly as they did. All the forces can be assembled and come into place, and then suddenly something happens. I was in the history department here with Sam Raymer when the Soviet Union fell, and he was less surprised by it than I was, but I was stunned. It just every day it was how can this be happening? I wasn't against it, but I couldn't believe it was really happening so quickly. But that's because large historical changes often come about through a long process of all the pieces kind of coming into place. So I don't know. I don't know the answer to your question, but let me put it this way. It does seem to me that Nietzsche talks in the text from which I quoted very briefly and selectively. It's actually very helpful on this whole issue, even though he would not advocate the restoration of Christianity to cultural hegemony, but he sees in the development of a certain kind of reflexivity of human beings that goes with this Judeo-Christian morality, a kind of self-contempt that human beings have lost touch with their instinctive life and with the nobility of cruelty. I mean, he makes a case for cruelty early in that same chapter of Genealogy of Morals. So, I mean, it's one of the ways of looking at this is that you could see this morality sort of shoved out by a kind of neo-pagan revival. I don't see it. I think a restoration of something like the biblical religions would be more likely, but I'm no prophet. It's possible, yeah. I mean, I tend to think that, you know, René Girard's understanding of violence as a source of the violence is very powerful to me, and he sees this notion of mimesis, that we tend to imitate one another and try to emulate one another. This is going to be true on whatever level of physical or economic scarcity you're talking about, and so it isn't going to matter that you reach higher and higher levels of economic development and comfort and prosperity. You'll still have the basis for that mimetic competition built into the nature of human societies.
Part of my question.
But I think yeah. I mean, I think I hear something else that you're asking, which is maybe we would feel guilty because we really shouldn't be this way. You know, I say this all the time to my friends in the professoriate who complain about how horrible their lives are. I say, you know, you've got a job that's the envy of the universe. You can set your own hours. You can pursue your own interests. You know, and here you are complaining because you're not making Donald Trump's salary. Do you really want to be Donald Trump? I mean, is that part of what you mean? Is this sort of inability to kind of appreciate that which one has? You know, that I do think that as we can do more things, I mean, my example about how I could, you know, sell all my stocks and buy a McDonald's hamburger with that. But no, I could liquidate all my possessions and go to some place of extreme poverty and take my resources and make them available to that starving child that I mentioned. And you could say, well, you know, you can make all kinds of arguments about, well, that really wouldn't do any good. What about tomorrow? What about you really have to change the whole structural. It's, you know, and all of that makes sense. But the fact is, the reason I interjected, you couldn't do this in the 17th century. You just literally could not have done it. It is for us now an option, just the same as picking up the phone and calling somewhere on the other side of the world is something you can do. You might not want to do it or have any reason to do it, but you can do it. It is within the range of doable things. And I think that opens up the realm of moral responsibility. You could adopt that kid across the street who is in a struggling family. You could, I mean, even though it would be an extraordinary, heroic, possibly foolish thing to do, you could do it. There are all sorts of things that face us every day. And, you know, one of the things I feel strongly about this is that, you know, it's easy to make fun of these things. I was sort of doing it, although I could never reduce my carbon footprint enough. But, you know, all of us who teach know that many of our most morally impressive students are the very ones who can't quite arrive at common sense boundaries of where their moral obligations begin and where they end. You know, should I really be thinking about, you know, if I bring my lunch in a brown bag, is that a wasteful thing? You know, should I be sort of carrying it in my hands, or some other way be less wasteful in my use of natural resources? And I don't want to laugh at that. But I think it reflects a cognitive problem, a problem that we have in defining what where the boundaries end for what we can legitimately and rationally and sensibly be held responsible for, and other things that those of us who are a little older will just laugh and say, oh, you're being ridiculous in taking all that on yourself. Well, I'm not, I admit I laugh at it sometimes, but I don't think it's an entirely risible position to take. It reflects a kind of moral grandeur, even a level of sympathy that is admirable, if foolish. Well, I think a distinction between pathological guilt and guilt as culpability is a very useful to observe, and I think that's one of the. I mean, I'm not against the therapeutic revolution, because it does seem to me that it's directed towards the relief of various forms of pathological guilt. But part of what I'm trying to get at, and maybe I differ from Nietzsche here, tremble at the thought, but is that the argument that Pascal Bruckner makes, that this is really best understood, it's a very Nietzschean argument, that this is all this Western guilt is best seen as a kind of masochism, as a kind of psychological derangement that has afflicted the West. This seems wrong to me. I can understand why he arrives at that view, but it seems to me, in a way, part of our problem is that the moral sense is stronger and harder to extinguish than we sometimes are willing to allow. That in a way we are better than we give ourselves credit for being. That we have certain moral needs that are as strong as physical needs that have to be attended to in the way we think about the world, the way we act in the world. I don't know whether that really responds to you or not, but it's part of what you said triggered in my mind. So I think it is a problem. I think it's a terrible problem but in politics has always had this problem of being a vehicle for some people to work out their salvation with fear and trembling, as the Bible says. And I think we're better off with less of that, whether it's coming from whatever side of the political spectrum. But I'd be reluctant to sort of say that the left has either a lock on sort of compassion or on guilt, on susceptibility to guilt. I think you might find it. You might find a difference in terms of this attachment to sort of the theoretical taking precedence. So, although conservatives talk about creative destruction, yeah, it's too bad that Joe Blow's business down the street failed, but it's creative destruction. Too bad all those steel workers have lost their jobs, but it's creative destruction. It's too bad the GM workers are being laid off, but that's the way it goes, because we got to let creative destruction roll. So, I mean, there's a bit of that kind of canopy of theory on both sides, I think. In defense of environmentalists and environmental guilt in this regard, I mean, it's partly because the nature of the problems being described that relate to a kind of vast interdependency and interconnectedness in the biosphere that you're not going to see when you just walk down to the creek. I mean, you might see, things look different than they did last year, but not really have any way of understanding why or how, and that ecological science provides a way of understanding that, but it necessarily moves you away from the particulars of your life and of your immediate life world into this much more abstract and schematic understanding. That I don't think there's any doubt that does go with the phenomenon I'm describing, that move towards abstraction, because your immediate sphere is limited. The number of people that I can actually know that can actually be my real friends, not Facebook friends, but real friends, is finite. So the number of people I can, the number of students that I can have office hours with is finite. Unless I do student hours on a MOOC, and then I can have a meaningless meeting with every student in the world.